You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, in this particular segment, we're going to take a look at World War I. Now, a radical writer in the midst of the First World War wrote that war is the health of the state. And it was written by Randolph Bourne. And Randolph Bourne criticized the nations of Europe that went to war in 1914, and he opposed the entry of the United States into World War I. This is a war that was referred to by historian Howard Zinn as the pit of death and deception. So I wish to honor Howard Zinn and his interpretation of World War I by sharing with you some significant parts of the chapter that he wrote on World War I. Just prior to the war, Howard Zinn would write that the U.S. was worried about the health of the state. J.P. Morgan had testified that World War I opened during a period of hard times. Businesses throughout the country were depressed. Farm prices deflated. Unemployment was serious. And the heavy industries were working far below capacity. And most importantly, he had testified that bank clearings were off. But he said that the war orders of the Allies, mostly England, by 1915 stimulated the U.S. economy, and thus giving credence to Randolph Bourne's "War is the health of the state." Now, these are very, very important. This is a very important statement because you should understand what's going on today. Despite the prosperity, the government was worried about socialism. And the government was worried about the IWW because the industrial workers of the world seemed to be everywhere. And President Wilson won the 1916 election with the promise that the United States would stay neutral in the war, despite the fact that the United States had been shipping war material to Germany's enemies, as revealed in the sinking of the British liner, the Lusitania. And class conflict was intense. And in the summer of 1916, during the Preparedness Day parade in San Francisco, a bomb exploded, killing 10 people. And 2 socialists were blamed despite their innocence. Tom Mooney and Warren Billings are going to be arrested, and they're going to spend 20 years in prison for a crime that they did not commit. And Senator James Wadsworth, as noted by Howard Zinn, suggested from New York, suggested that compulsory military training for all males should be for all males to avert the danger, in his words, that these people of ours shall be divided into classes. Rather, we must let our young men know that they owe some responsibility to this country. And so, of course, the ultimate responsibility was to take place in Europe, where 10 million would die on the battlefield and 20 million would die of hunger and disease related to the war. But prosperity depended upon foreign markets. In the United States, more than $2 billion worth of goods had been sold to the Allies. Howard Zinn quotes Richard Hofstadter, a famous U.S. historian of World War I, saying that America became bound up with the Allies in a fateful union of war and prosperity. Now there is another added dimension that's brought up by Howard Zinn, and that is W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois, the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, is going to argue with regards to the war. I'm wearing this shirt so that you can understand something about joining the Army. Uncle Sam became the official image by which to sell war to the American public. And so I just wore a shirt honoring the significance of what war means, okay? So W.B. Du Bois is going to write a very significant article called The African Roots of War. And in it he argued that World War I was a war for empire. It was a struggle between Germany and the Allies over Africa. And he wrote, in his words, in a very real sense, Africa is a prime cause of this terrible overturning of civilization, which we have lived to see. Because to him, Africa had what Europe desired. And Europeans were fighting for African gold, for diamonds, for cocoa, rubber, ivory, and palm oil. And these were the resources that Europe was fighting for. And Du Bois warned that racism was working well in Europe and the United States in their fight to control Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The white working classes of imperial countries were being called upon to share in the loot. And he explained in his words that the white working man has been asked to share the spoil of exploiting, quote unquote, chinks and niggers. Du Bois answered why the average citizen of England, France, Germany, and the US had a higher standard of living. Whence comes this new wealth? It comes primarily from the darker nations of the world, Asia and Africa, South and Central America, the West Indies, and the islands of the South Seas. It is no longer simply the merchant prince or the aristocratic monopoly or even the employing class that is exploiting the world. It is the nation, a new democratic nation composed of united capital and labor. So it became very clear to W.E.B. Du Bois that war is the health of the state, and that racism was the foundation for the success of capitalist nations. Now, when the United States entered World War I, the government had to work hard to create a consensus because public opinion revealed no desire for the war. And after all, again, Woodrow Wilson won the election of 1916 on the promise not to enter World War I. So there was no spontaneous urge to fight. And so the United States implements the draft law, conscription. The U.S. embarked on an elaborate propaganda campaign to enlist young men, and those who resisted faced harsh punishments. And it is there where we get the official symbol of Uncle Sam as the man. Now, one of the things that happened was the passage of what will be known as the Espionage Act of 1917. It was passed under a Democratic administration of Woodrow Wilson during World War I. And the Espionage Act forbade the use of disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the United States, scurrilous language against its flag, or if you said anything bad about its armed forces, or if you said a speech that caused others to view the American government or its institutions with contempt. The act allowed the U.S. Mail Service or the Postmaster General to refuse to deliver mail, especially those who mail that contained speech or opinions against the war. And the act was to be applied only to times when the United States is in war. So the Espionage Act, of which the Alien and Sedition Act came under its purview, made it a crime to aid enemies of the United States or to interfere with the war effort or with military recruitment. The Sedition Act extended its provisions to cover a broad range of offenses, notably speech and the expression of opinion that cast the government or the war effort in a negative light or interfered with the sale of government bonds. Howard Zinn called this act the nation's most extreme anti-speech legislation. Those convicted under the act generally received sentences of imprisonment for 10 to 20 years if you spoke against World War I. And as Howard Zinn notes, the Espionage Act, thus approved by the Supreme Court, has remained in the books all these years since World War I. And although it was supposed to apply only in wartime, it has been consistently enforced since 1950 because the United States has legally been in a state of emergency since the Korean War. And this act has since been replaced by today's Patriot Act, but nonetheless, it is still being implemented, and then especially in the case of Julian Assange. Now, let's understand something about the Red Scare. The intense patriotic atmosphere of war is going to be aggravated by national, social, and political tensions that was caused by a working class population that desired political justice and economic democracy. So the term Red Scare was coined by a political scientist of the era, and it was used to describe the government's response to political radicalism and the fear of a socialist revolution. That revolution was working its way out in Russia when workers who were fighting in the front lines for the Tsar during World War I decided to stop fighting German soldiers and instead are going back to Russia and to overthrow the feudal aristocracy, which initiated the Bolshevik Revolution. So the first Red Scare in the United States began following the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Murray B. Levin wrote that the Red Scare was a nationwide anti-radical hysteria provoked by a mounting fear of red monkeys and anxiety that a Bolshevik revolution in America was imminent, a revolution that would change church, home, marriage, civility, and the American way of life. The newspapers exacerbated those political forms into a xenophobia. The press portrayed the advocacy of Eugene Debs, the tactics of the IWW, the cry for equality from Russian and Italian immigrants, and any unionization efforts as crimes against society, as conspiracies against the government, and as plots to establish communism. So the Red Scare preoccupied America from 1917 into the 1920s. So let's go and let's appreciate the case of Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs, in June of 1918, Eugene Debs visited 3 socialists who were in prison for opposing the draft. He then spoke in front of an audience across the street from the jail. He not only spoke of his friends in jail, but he told those that gathered the following. They tell us that we live in a great free republic, that our institutions are democratic, that we are a free and self-governing people. That is too much for a joke. Wars throughout history are waged for conquest and plunder. And that is war in a nutshell. The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. Let's listen to actor Tim Robbins narrate Debs' Canton, Ohio speech of 1918.
After Woodrow Wilson had been elected president on the pledge that he would not go to war, the United States declared war and entered the sort of slaughterhouse going on in Europe. Socialists opposed this. The socialist leader, Eugene Debs, in June of 1918, made a speech in Canton, Ohio, about the war. He was sent to prison for 10 years, approved by a unanimous Supreme Court. This is the speech that led to his imprisonment.
Sam Johnson declared that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. He must have had the Wall Street gentry in mind, or at least their prototypes, for in every age, it has been the tyrant, the oppressor, and the exploiter who has wrapped himself in the cloak of patriotism or religion or both to deceive and overawe the people. Every solitary one of these aristocratic conspirators and would-be murderers claims to be an arch-patriot. Every one of them insists that the war is being waged to make the world safe for democracy. What humbug! What rot! What false pretense! Wars throughout history have been waged for conquest and plunder. In the Middle Ages, where the feudal lords concluded to enlarge their domains, to increase their power, their prestige, and their wealth, they declared war upon one another. But they themselves did not go to war, any more than the modern feudal lords, the barons of Wall Street, go to war. The feudal barons of the Middle Ages, the economic predecessors of the capitalists of our day, declared all wars, and their miserable serfs fought all the battles. The poor, ignorant serfs had been taught to revere their masters, to believe that when their masters declared war upon one another, it was their patriotic duty to fall upon one another and to cut one another's throats for the profit and the glory of the lords and barons who held them in contempt. And that is war in a nutshell. The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. The master class had everything to gain and nothing to lose, while the subject class has had nothing to gain and everything to lose, especially their lives. They have always taught you and trained you to believe it to be your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourself slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, the people have never had a voice in declaring war. And strange as it certainly appears, no war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people. The working class who fight all the battles, the working class who make the supreme sacrifices, the working class who freely shed their blood and furnish the corpses, have never yet had a voice in either declaring war or making peace. It is the ruling class that invariably does both. They alone declare war, and they alone make peace. Yours not to reason why, yours just to do or die. That is their motto, and we object on the part of the awakening workers of this nation. If war is right, let it be declared by the people.
Okay, so Debs is going to be arrested for violating the Espionage Act. Why? Because there were draft-age youths in the audience, and his words would obstruct the recruitment and the enlistment services of those youth. And Debs refused at his trial to take the stand in his defense or call a witness on his behalf. And as Howard Zinn notes, he denied nothing about what he said, and when he spoke to the jury before he began its deliberations. He said, "I have been accused of obstructing the war. I admit it, gentlemen. I abhor war. I would oppose war if I stood alone. I have sympathy with the suffering, struggling people everywhere. It does not make any difference under what flag they were born or where they live." So the jury is going to find him guilty, and Debs is going to address the judge before sentencing. And this is what he said. "Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." Now, Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And while doing time in prison, he is going to run for the presidency of the United States in 1920. And while in prison, he will garner close to 1 million votes under the Socialist Party ticket. So just for your information, one of the heroes of Bernie Sanders is Eugene Debs. Now, the war gave the opportunity to the federal government to destroy the industrial workers of the world. And in September of 1917, the Department of Justice agents made simultaneous raids across the nation. And hence, it came to be known as the IWW trial. 48 IWW meeting halls were broken into, and their correspondence and their literature was seized and became courtroom evidence. 165 IWW leaders were arrested for conspiring to hinder the draft, for encouraging desertion, and intimidating others in connection with labor disputes. And 101 IWW members went on trial in April 1918, and the jury found them all guilty. And Big Bill Haywood and 14 others are going to be sentenced to 20 years in prison, and another 33 are going to be given 10 years, and they're going to be fined a total of $2.5 million. Now, the IWW is going to be identified by a journalist named John Reed. You saw Warren Beatty play John Reed in the film clip that I shared with you previously on the IWW. And John Reed wrote that the outdoorsmen, the hard rock blasters, the tree fellers, the wheat binders, the longshoremen, the boys who do the strong work, these were the workers who had challenged the federal government. And the IWW was shattered. But the IWW is going to use the court case, they're going to use the trial to tell about their activities. Now, one of my favorite testimonies as presented by Howard Zinn in his People's History of the United States is the following. You ask me why the IWW is not patriotic to the United States? If you were a bum without a blanket, if you had left your wife and kids when you went west for a job and had never located them since, if your job had never kept you long enough in a place to qualify you to vote, if you slept in a lousy, sour bunkhouse and ate food just as rotten as they could give you and get by with it, if deputy sheriffs shot your cooking cans full of holes and spilled your grub on the ground, if your wages were lowered on you when the boss thought they had you down, if there was one law for Ford, Sir, and Mooney and another for Harry Thaw, if every person who represented law and order and the nation beat you up, railroaded you to jail, and the good Christian people cheered and told them to go to it, well, how in hell do you expect a man to be patriotic? This war is a businessman's war, and we don't see why we should go out and get shot in order to save the lovely state of affairs that we now enjoy. Well, in 1918, Wilson and Congress is going to go one step further so that they can have another lovely state of affairs. And they're going to identify immigrants as dangerous subversives. And they amended the 1917 Espionage Act to include aliens and sedition. So there are two precedents for Americans to use the term alien when referring to immigrants. The first is the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1796. These acts were passed under John Adams' administration in an attempt to quell immigrant discontent in the political system. And the second of these acts is 1918. Again, this term alien is important because the term alien is associated with sedition. Hence, when you use the term alien, it indicates that the person is identifying people who are not loyal to the United States. This is part of the American national character. So when the American hears that there is an alien, then they mean that that person is not loyal to the United States. So the term alien indicates that the person is using it to identify people who are not loyal. So to be alien connotes sedition. So loyalty is the catchword. Let's listen to a legal expert address the ramifications of the 1918 Alien and Sedition Act.
In the aftermath of the First World War, as the country began to think about what was meant by a, quote, return to normalcy, unquote, part of the agenda was to craft a more comprehensive social control form of immigration and deportation laws. And the laws that were developed in 1917 had both ideological components and criminal enforcement components. And in many ways, that was the first comprehensive sort of modern type of deportation law that we saw. And it arose out of a lot of loyalty controversies that had taken place during the war. And it also confirmed the role of the federal government and the bureaucratized model of deportation enforcement. So it started focusing on criminal aliens as well as focusing on people who were ideologically deemed to be subject to deportation, anarchists and socialists in particular. Those things sort of developed parallel together during that period. And I think the underlying idea was that there are certain people who are just not worthy of being members of American society, and even if they have been admitted legally, we should get rid of them. A lot of the discourse as it develops in the 1920s around these sorts of laws focuses on an alleged crime problem that was largely undertaken by non-citizens. When you actually read more sober studies of the period, you might really question whether there was such a crime wave. And also, you would notice that there were a lot of native-born American citizens who were engaged in criminal activities as well. But the public discourse began to shift, particularly with the rise of J. Edgar Hoover and the early FBI. The focus turned increasingly to deporting non-citizen criminal aliens, particularly those convicted of crimes involving moral turpitude, which was a category that was developed in those early laws, and also people with drug offenses. And so the mechanisms of deportation, the systems became increased, the funding became increased, the bureaucracy became much larger, and we started seeing more people being focused on. This continued into the 30s and the 1940s, and in many ways has continued to the present day.
So for us today, this loyalty became emphasized after 9/11. The Patriot Act of 2002 dramatically reduced restrictions on law enforcement agencies' ability to search telephone, email communications, medical, financial, and other records of private citizens. It eased restrictions on foreign intelligence gathering within the United States. It expanded the Secretary of the Treasury's authority to regulate financial transactions, and particularly those involving foreign individuals and ethnicities and other entities. And it broadened the discretion of law enforcement and immigration authorities in detaining and deporting immigrants suspected of terrorism-related acts. The acts also expanded the definition of terrorism to include domestic terrorism, thus enlarging the number of activities to which the USA Patriot Act's expanded law enforcement powers could be applied. What we see today is the right's attempt to squeal about a Mexican immigrant's undocumented status as some terrorist act, sort of a feat of criminal activity. Now, all in all, despite the immigrants' choice to search for an economic existence in this country, when we take a look at the legislative acts implemented by Congress to help us understand the process that immigrants have had to go through to become a part of this community known as the United States of America, in almost all of these acts, passage is based on a fear of the other, a fear of the not me, a fear of the stranger at the gate. So let's recognize this fear factor when discussing issues related to immigration and the formation and control of labor forces. Let's appreciate the Palmer raids. Now, the Palmer raids were attempts by the United States Department of Justice to arrest and deport radical immigrants from the United States. The raids and the arrests occurred in November 1919 and January 1920 under the leadership of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Though more than 500 foreign citizens are going to be deported, including a number of prominent leftist leaders such as Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, Palmer's efforts were largely frustrated by the officials at the U.S. Department of Labor who had responsibility for deportations, not through the Attorney General. And they objected to Palmer's methods in disrespect of the legal process. Palmer just went out and rounded them up. The Palmer raids occurred in the larger context of the Red Scare, the term given to fear of and reaction against political radicals in the U.S. in the years immediately following World War I. So, at 9 p.m. on November 7, 1919, this was a date chosen specifically because it was the second anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The agents of the Bureau of Investigation, which eventually would become the FBI, together with local police, are going to execute a series of well-publicized and violent raids against Russian workers in 12 cities. The newspaper accounts reported that many were badly beaten during the arrests, and many later are going to swear that they were threatened and beaten during questioning. Government agents are going to cast a very wide net, bringing in some American citizens, and these were just passers-by who admitted being Russian, but not members of the Russian Workers' League. Others were teachers that were conducting night school classes in spaces that were shared with the targeted immigrants. The arrests far exceeded the number of warrants. Of the 650 arrested in New York City alone, the government managed just to have 43 deported. Let's take a look at a documentary clip of the raids and appreciate the significance of these raids.
The decades leading up to the bombing on Wall Street had been marked by a great deal of social unrest and anti-capitalist agitation. In 1919, there was a coordinated bombing attack on 7 eastern cities, and one of those bombs targeted the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer. It really stoked fears that this was the beginning of a much broader attack on capitalism in the country. There was a huge clamoring from the public to take more drastic action. The Palmer raids were a series of raids to arrest and deport individuals suspected of radical activities against the government. These raids were conducted across the country in November of 1919 and January of 1920. They arrested Emma Goldman and a number of communist sympathizers and activists. It was a fairly violent affair. It became clear that a number of the people arrested didn't even belong to a radical organization. Some of them were American citizens. They were held under arrest without warrant. There was a real backlash to the civil liberties violations that many perceived these raids constituted.
Now, the repression of radicals increased after the war ended, especially when the Justice Department hired a young J. Edgar Hoover to head its radical division. In one of the most famous of cases, 2 Italian anarchists are going to be charged with the holdup and murder that took place in South Braintree, Massachusetts during the afternoon of April 15, 1920. Ferdinando Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti are going to be convicted of murder and sentenced to death. And they spent 7 years in jail while appeals went on. The people all over the country, indeed all over the world, became involved in their case. Now, the trial record and the surrounding circumstances suggested that Sacco and Vanzetti are going to be sentenced to death not because they were guilty of the murders, but because they were Italian, they were foreign immigrants, they were alien, they were seditious, they were anarchists. So when they were electrocuted in August 1927, the police had to break up marches, demonstrations, and picket lines with arrests and beatings as people protested the executions. Troops had to surround the prison. So we're going to take a look to end this particular session on World War I. We're going to take a look at a trailer to a documentary that's entitled Sacco and Vanzetti. This is a movie that brings to life the story of 2 Italian immigrant anarchists. So let's take a look at Sacco and Vanzetti to end this particular segment.
Where we are is the crime site of you might say, the crime of the century.
I can remember walking up the street alone and seeing all these cars and people around my house, and I couldn't believe what had happened.
It's a lot more than a criminal case. It's a phenomenon.
These were not 2 ordinary men. These were men of poetic sensibilities. These were men of infinite courage. Sacco and Vanzetti are anarchists. They are opponents of the war. They are unpatriotic. And this becomes far more important than whether they committed this robbery and this murder.
There's really no place in the world that's untouched by this trial by the summer of 1927. I think one of the reasons that the case has lasting meaning is because it speaks to issues that remain alive today.
There's always something that happens in the daily newspapers that brings that case to mind.
It's a story that talks about the injustices of prejudice in a society because of the social position that you occupy.
It exposes realities that many people would like to forget. If you espouse the wrong political views, if you're not a conformist, the chances of you getting a fair trial are substantially diminished. And if Italians are no longer looked upon with the disdain and contempt they were in 1920, they've been replaced by other ethnic groups.